They called it refinement. To the common people standing outside the palace gates, the world of kings and queens was one of impossible beauty, where candlelight shimmered on crystal goblets, and every step of a royal footman seemed choreographed to perfection. Yet, the closer you were allowed to get, the more you noticed the shadows between the gold. Behind the velvet curtains and beneath the layers of brocade, there was something the portraits never showed. It was a truth rarely spoken aloud, preserved only in fragments of private letters and the memoirs of those who had served too closely. A truth that, once known, could not be unseen. The most powerful rulers of Europe, for all their splendor, lived with habits that today might make us recoil. It was not simply that they bathed infrequently, though many did. It was the reasoning behind it, the deeply rooted belief that water, touching the skin too often, could open the body to sickness, even death. The royal physicians swore by it, citing ancient authorities, and the monarchs obeyed. In a world without germ theory, tradition carried the weight of law. Consider the winter of 1715, when King Louis XIV of France, by then an old man, the Sunday king, whose reign had defined an era, was said to have taken fewer than 3 full baths in an entire year. He masked the human scent with heavy clouds of ambergris and rosewater, and his courtiers, eager to flatter, claimed the perfume itself was part of His Majesty's aura. But servants wrote differently in their private accounts, that the king's skin, beneath the silks, was pale and fragile, and that he sometimes scratched until blood appeared. And Louis was not alone. Across the Channel, in the court of England's King James I, similar customs held sway. James detested bathing, declaring it a danger to health. Instead, he relied on the change of linen shirts, sometimes several times a day, as a way of cleansing the body. The fresh linen, it was believed, would draw out the impurities through the skin. His queen, Anne of Denmark, followed the same routine, though her ladies quietly noted the lingering scent of clove oil and vinegar, an olfactory shield, as much a part of her attire as her jewels. These were not isolated quirks. They were the norm in royal Europe. The irony was almost poetic. Those who commanded the wealth of empires lived bound by rituals that today might seem primitive, yet in their minds were marks of civilization. It was a different kind of battlefield, one where tradition fought progress, and superstition guarded the throne as fiercely as any sword. And for those born into it, princes, princesses, courtiers, there was no escape. The rules were as much a prison as the walls of the palace itself. You could obey and remain in favor, or you could challenge them and watch the doors of power close forever. This, then, is not simply a tale about hygiene. It is about belief, status, and the invisible chains of custom chains that bound even the most gilded of lives. And, as we will see, for some, those chains would tighten into a fate from which there was no return. In the courts of Europe, tradition was not merely inherited, it was enforced. Every royal custom, no matter how strange, was wrapped in the language of duty and survival. To refuse it was to risk more than gossip. It was to risk the suspicion that you were unfit for the crown. The physicians were the gatekeepers of this unspoken order. In Paris, the Royal Medical Council warned that frequent bathing weakens the spirit and leaves the body exposed to the humours of the air. In London, court doctors repeated the same advice in Latin, as if the weight of the ancient tongue would make it unquestionable. The monarchs listened, but some did not entirely believe. Take Princess Charlotte of Saxony, married into the French court in the mid-18th century. In letters smuggled to her sister, she wrote of the suffocating layers of perfume and powder, of the days when her skin felt as though it wore a second, invisible gown. She confessed that she longed for the feel of water, that in her childhood she had played in the Elbe's summer shallows, without fear of sickness. But here, in Versailles, even a basin of warm water was considered suspect. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered about her strange northern habits when she insisted on washing her hands and face with more than the rosewater customary at court. They began to watch her, not out of loyalty, but because deviation was dangerous. If she ignored tradition too openly, enemies could twist it into a sign of rebellion, or worse, a foreign contempt for French ways. Across the sea, in England, King Charles II was wrestling with a different pressure. His court was a place of calculated appearances, where fashion could win an ally and a well-timed jest could save a reputation. Charles understood the theatre of monarchy, but privately he was troubled by the toll these customs took. He had read in secret accounts from travellers who spoke of public bathhouses in the East and of the clear health of those who washed often. Such ideas fascinated him. Yet he dared not speak them aloud, not when the memory of civil war still hung over the kingdom, and every deviation from the old ways could be seized upon by Parliament as a sign of instability. Here lay the great irony. Many of these rulers sensed that the old beliefs might be flawed, but the very structure of power made change impossible. In the corridors of influence, tradition was a currency, and to spend it carelessly was to court ruin. Even the servants, those closest to the daily lives of their royal masters, understood the stakes. A valet who suggested a bath might find himself reassigned, or worse, dismissed. And yet, some took the risk. There are records, faint but persistent, of maids bringing secretly boiled water to their mistresses, of footmen fetching pails from hidden wells under the cover of night. These acts were small rebellions, but in a world so tightly wound, even the smallest act could unravel much more than intended. For those caught in this web, hygiene was no longer just a question of comfort. It was a matter of loyalty, identity, and political survival. Every basin of water became a potential scandal, every refusal to follow the accepted practice a declaration of war. And so the stage was set for conflict. Not a war of armies, but a war of appearances, a quiet struggle in which victory meant invisibility, and defeat could mean exile. Some would navigate it with cunning. Others would not survive it at all. It began, as such things often do, with something small. Versailles, summer of 1756. The heat was oppressive, thick with the scent of lilies from the gardens, and the heavy perfumes that clung to the air like a second skin. Princess Charlotte of Saxony, by now 3 years into her life at the French court, had endured weeks of social obligations, each more suffocating than the last. Her gown, stiff with embroidery, chafed at her shoulders. The powder on her wig itched at her scalp. Beneath it all, she could feel her own body rebelling against the layers of civility imposed upon it. On the morning it happened, she dismissed her attendants earlier than usual. The excuse was a headache. The truth was something far more dangerous. From a chest kept locked in her private chamber, she retrieved a simple porcelain basin and a pitcher of water carried in secret by a loyal maid who remembered their shared homeland. Steam curled gently from the surface. The first splash against her skin was almost shocking. She gasped, not from cold, but from the alien sensation of being truly clean. She washed slowly, savoring each movement, as though reclaiming a piece of herself that had been stolen upon her arrival in France. For a brief, treacherous moment, she forgot the rules. But in the court of Versailles, walls had ears. That afternoon, during the Queen's card reception, Charlotte felt the change in the room before she saw it. Conversations paused when she approached. A pair of duchesses exchanged glances, their fans moving just a little too quickly. Even the servants seemed to hover at a distance, as if uncertain whether to greet her. By the next day, whispers had spread. The Saxon princess was indulging in foreign bathing habits, endangering her health, and more damningly showing disdain for French tradition. In the language of court politics, this was not about hygiene, it was about loyalty. Across the Channel, a similar breach was unfolding. In Whitehall, King Charles II had quietly ordered a marble bathing chamber constructed in a private wing. Officially, it was to serve as a decorative folly, something to amuse visiting dignitaries. Unofficially, Charles intended to use it. Late at night, with only his most trusted valet present, the king would lower himself into the warm, scented water and remain there for hours, speaking of matters he would tell no one else. But secrecy is a fragile thing. One night, a courtier, curious about the soft sound of water echoing through the corridor, followed the noise to its source. He saw enough, more than enough, to understand that the king had broken with custom. By morning, Parliament's more hostile members were muttering about un-English indulgences and weakness of the royal constitution. The danger for both Charlotte and Charles was not the act itself, but what it symbolized. In courts built on tradition, even a private gesture could be read as a public statement. For Charlotte, the act of bathing became an accusation that she rejected the ways of her adopted country. For Charles, it was proof to his enemies that he was too easily swayed by foreign influence. Neither could defend themselves without admitting the truth, and so they remained silent, allowing rumor to grow teeth. Every headache Charlotte suffered afterward was blamed on her dangerous habit. Every missed appearance by Charles was whispered to be the result of water fevers brought on by his secret baths. In both palaces, the walls were closing in. Allies grew scarce. Smiles became thinner, more calculated. What had begun as a private attempt at comfort was mutating into a political liability, one that could not be washed away. History remembers wars, treaties, and coronations. It forgets the quiet rebellions, the ones that happen in locked rooms and candlelit corridors. Yet, it is often those small acts, the private choices, that set the course of a life, or a reign. For Charlotte and Charles, the first breach had been made, and in the rigid architecture of royal tradition, once a crack appears, it can only widen. By autumn, the whispers had grown teeth. At Versailles, Princess Charlotte no longer entered a room without sensing the shift, fans snapping open, heads bending toward each other, the air thick with the perfume of suspicion. The Duchess de Villeneuve, whose smile could slice paper, was overheard remarking that foreign water breeds foreign disease. It was a clever insult, veiled enough to avoid censure, sharp enough to draw blood. The Queen herself said nothing, but her silence was worse than open rebuke. Invitations to private suppers grew fewer. When Charlotte's name was read for a place beside the Queen at a hunting banquet, a courtier mistakenly called another. Each omission was small, deniable, but together they were the architecture of exile. In Whitehall, King Charles II faced his own siege. Rumours of his midnight bathing chamber had reached the House of Commons. Opposition members, already wary of his Catholic sympathies and foreign alliances, seized the opportunity. Pamphlets began to circulate in London's coffeehouses, depicting the king as effeminate, wasteful, and softened by continental indulgences. Charles laughed them off in public. In private, he felt the walls tightening. A simple cough in the morning could spark a flurry of speculation among his ministers. Every decision he made was weighed not on its merit, but on whether it reflected strength or weakness. Even his closest advisors began to tread lightly, as if his judgment might be dampened quite literally by his habits. For both Charlotte and Charles, the choice was the same: abandon the practice and restore appearances, or hold the line and risk their positions. Charlotte tried compromise. She limited her bathing to rare occasions, always in secrecy, always with the same loyal maid. But Versailles was a place where secrets were currency, and every purchase came at a price. A footman claimed to have seen steam curling from beneath her chamber door. By evening, the story had inflated into "the princess immerses herself daily, defying all medical counsel." Charles chose defiance. He continued his baths, even commissioning scented oils from Florence. But the more he clung to them, the more his enemies framed it as proof of his vanity, his foreign corruption. When a mild fever swept the palace, striking several courtiers, the gossip was immediate. "The king has brought this upon us with his unholy waters." The tragedy was not in the act, but in the isolation it bred. For Charlotte, once a promising figure in the French court, the invitations stopped altogether. Her apartments, once buzzing with visitors, grew quiet. Servants assigned to her quarters rotated frequently, an old trick to prevent loyalty from forming. For Charles, the effect was subtler but just as corrosive. Trust frayed among his ministers. Alliances hesitated. When the Dutch ambassador arrived to discuss a delicate treaty, Parliament insisted that the meeting be held publicly, an unmistakable signal that the king's private counsel could no longer be trusted. Neither ruler had yet fallen, but both could see the edge of the cliff. In the machinery of royal politics, perception was power, and once it slipped from your grasp, it was nearly impossible to reclaim. History books will not list bathing as the cause of exile or political downfall. They will point to treaties, wars, and dynastic disputes. But in the shadows of those grand events, the small, human choices, the ones made in quiet chambers, were often the true levers of fate. And for Charlotte and Charles, the lever was already moving, inch by inch, toward the inevitable. By the winter of the following year, the verdict was clear, though no one would speak it aloud. In Versailles, Princess Charlotte's role had diminished to a shadow. She still attended official ceremonies, her smile perfectly composed, but her place in the Queen's inner circle was gone. The loyal maid who once brought her hidden pitchers of water had been reassigned to another household. The marble basin lay unused in a locked chest, like the relic of a crime too dangerous to repeat. In Whitehall, King Charles II survived the political season, but not without scars. His private bathing chamber remained, though the marble had grown cold more often than warm. Ministers, when they spoke of the king's strength, chose their words carefully, always in public, never in private. The pamphlets mocking him had faded from the coffeehouses, but the suspicion lingered, quiet as dust on a closed book. Neither had been deposed, neither had fallen into outright disgrace. Yet both had paid the price of a breach too small for the history books, but too large for the courts to forgive. In their world, survival was not merely about ruling, it was about remaining untouchable. Years later, their names would appear in the chronicles alongside treaties, marriages, and minor scandals. The matter of their habits would be absent entirely. Yet in the whispers of archivists and the margins of forgotten letters, the story persisted. How water simple, clean, and harmless to us had once been treated as treachery and silk. And perhaps that is the greater truth. In the courts of Europe, danger did not always wear armor or carry a dagger. Sometimes it came in the form of a porcelain basin, a locked door, and the quiet rebellion of a single choice. Whether the tale is fact, fiction, or something in between, I leave for you to decide. But if you should ever walk the marble corridors of Versailles or Whitehall, and pass a door behind which water once steamed in secret, remember this: even the smallest acts can leave ripples that touch the farthest shores of history.